This is part three of Setting the Questions lecture. We've been talking about effectiveness, and now I want to move on to talk a little bit about what offers healing. And this is one of our next framing questions here is what offers healing. Well, for the therapist, this can be considered in the therapy setting, but also beyond the therapy setting. And I've been using a lot of examples in the therapy setting, but I really want us to move beyond that in the class, and we'll be trying to offer a lot of suggestions about how to do that as we go through the course, and a lot of suggested questions for us to consider as we do that. Therapy effectiveness is often hampered by taking too narrow of a focus on what can offer healing. And this is, one of the foundational premises of this course is that we don't want to be stuck in these narrow focuses. So healing beyond therapy, where should we look? Well, cultural healing practices, I think, is something that becomes really important. That we can see this in a lot of different ways. Let me mention a couple of different examples here. In traditional Chinese medicine, the approach to medicine was a very holistic process that often included, and in traditional Chinese medicine was looking largely at physical health, but also in ways psychological health, and bringing in this holistic perspective of looking at the emotional aspects of it. It becomes a very holistic approach, and so there's many ways that traditional Chinese medicine can be integrated with psychotherapy practice, that can be used as an adjunct to psychotherapy practice, and that can be used for alternatives to therapy and healing. Similarly, a lot of my colleagues at Saybrook will talk about shamanism and how shamanism can be used often in healing practices, both for psychological and physical healing practices. Shamanism are very much embedded within indigenous cultures. There's many different forms of shamanism, but they can be quite effective in helping people identify and uncover psychological difficulties at times. So these types of cultural healing practices can be very powerful for individuals, individuals who are in therapy or as an alternative to it. Religion and spiritual approaches that prior to therapy coming about, and keep in mind, therapy is just a little bit over 100 years old at this point. There was a lot of responsibility given to the religious communities, often for taking care of people who were suffering psychologically. And so you will find that within the wisdom of a lot of the religious traditions of the world, there's quite a bit about dealing with psychological and emotional suffering. And there's a lot that can be offered, as well as just by becoming spiritually and religiously more healthy, deepening one's spiritual and religious connection, that often can be healing in and of itself. Furthermore, there are people that come to seek treatment in therapy or in other places, not as much directly because of the psychological difficulties, but because of their spiritual struggles. And these may then create some psychological difficulties. For example, in transpersonal psychology, there's a long tradition of talking about spiritual emergencies, which can very much play out here. For many years in my practice in psychotherapy, I've focused on working with people that have spiritual wounds, that have been hurt by the religious communities that they either have been a part of or are still a part of, and how that's been a painful thing that has created a lot of psychological suffering as well as spiritual questions. And for these individuals, a lot of times working through some of these religious and spiritual challenges and finding a more solid religious or spiritual foundation can be an important part of the healing process for them, and maybe what they're really looking for. The expressive arts. The expressive arts has been used a lot of times by cultures as indigenous healing practices. When I spend time in China each year, it's regular for it to come up that people will talk about how poetry and their paintings have had an important role in the history of China and dealing with a lot of the emotional struggles and suffering. That these have been practices that have been used to help people in their healing. We see this in uh, a lot of other settings where different cultural groups have used expressive practices. A lot of the carnival practices, for example, now we see them a lot of times as a big party. But historically, these emerged from deep spiritual traditions, and a lot of times they were brought about through African slaves that were brought over from Africa, trying to maintain some of their spiritual and religious roots that they've been taken away from. And so there's often a profound spiritual meaning that is a part of these celebrations that come out in the expressive arts and in the costumes and the dance and the music, and they're a way that people deal with this, with their suffering. So the expressive arts have long been a part of healing, and today they're often integrated into psychotherapy practice. I like to use poetry for my own healing and also in the therapy practice, and we'll probably talk about that some in this course too, that it can be very powerful. And many times I've made the comment more to make a point than anything that the best therapist that I've ever had in my life is poetry. I'm not sure that that's literally true, but I think in many ways there's a truth to it, because it's something that has been therapeutic for me that I've had through various different stages in my life that has been incredibly powerful for me personally. And I've seen this for other people too, a lot of clients that I've worked with, as well as a lot of people I've worked with outside of therapy in various different ways, in the teaching classroom or training setting, and other ways that have found been able to use expressive arts for their own healing. And then relationships outside of therapy. And this is something that a lot of people in psychology worry about now. They worry about, well, are they really doing therapy out, not calling it that? Well, I think in reality, a lot of people have been doing things that we now consider therapy long before therapy was ever created. So there's a lot of things that we do in the therapy context that is healing that we also do outside of it. I'll use the example a lot that in working with students that are studying to become therapists, they often become very worried about doing therapy with their friends. And so they stop doing things with their friends that they used to do. And I remember a couple times I've had students come in and make statements where their friends have basically confronted them about this. And they said, well, I can't do therapy with you now that I'm a therapist, or because I'm a therapist here. And basically the friend will come back and say, yeah, but you're not even a friend anymore. And so I think we see this is a nice illustration that so many of these things that are healing in therapy are also things that are healing in our life, in the relationships outside of therapy. For example, just empathetic listening can be powerful healing a lot of times. And hopefully you do that in your life when you're not in the role of therapist, if you're a therapist. And if you're not a therapist, hopefully you do that with your friends and family a lot of times just naturally. So relationships provide a very rich wealth of healing, even when they're not done in the context of psychotherapy. Let's talk a little bit about what diversity means for healing. We've talked about some of this quite a bit already. The desired outcomes of therapy are typically set by privileged individuals in positions of power and dictated to those who are suffering without their input. I think that is one of the key things that is one of the motivating factors for this class. The desired outcomes of therapy are typically set by privileged individuals in positions of power and dictated to those who are suffering without their input. And furthermore, how they should go about the healing is dictated to them. These tend to be highly biased towards values that are more common in privileged white heterosexual males. So there's a very strong bias in psychology, psychotherapy, and a lot of our traditional understandings of healing, which is one of the reasons why I think we need to look beyond therapy to other ways of healing that are not bound by these biases. Maybe by doing that, we can come back and see with a new set of lenses where these biases are in the field of psychotherapy. So maybe this experience of going beyond will help us come back, for those of us who are therapists, and look at therapy differently and recognize some of the biases and limitations inherent in what we do. That would be one of the hopes that I would have for what's going to come out of this course. Let me give some examples. There tends to be a bias that reason is good and emotions are bad. We should control our emotions. We should learn to get rid of a lot of our negative emotions. The idea of ridding ourselves and controlling, just that language, you can see in there, there's bias against emotion. But emotion's not such a bad thing. As an existentialist, I tend to think all of the emotions can be a good thing. Let's even look at grieving and suffering. And unfortunately, we talked a little bit about the DSM. The DSM is wanting to shorten the period of what can be considered normal grieving, which really is quite offensive to me. But what is the positive things about grieving? Well, for one, grieving is something that helps us to begin to work through a loss, to fill that hole. And what we often do in grieving is we turn to people, new people. So you have this hole that comes in your support system from the lost individual. And when we go to other people to grieve, by going to these other people, that starts to close that hole up. So grieving makes a lot of sense as a way to repair the losses in our social support system that occur at those times. It's a natural, healthy healing process. And what a lot of people will find too is when they are resistant to grieving, when they are resistant to feeling their pain, when they are resistant to going into that, it feels really bad. But when they allow themselves to go in and experience the pain, while it still may not feel good, it doesn't feel as bad as when they're resisting it, when they're fighting against it. And often it helps them start to see the possibilities of how those emotions can be transformed. So this bias of reason, calmness being good, emotions bad, is a bias that's in much of psychology, much of therapy, and I think a problematic one. Independence good, dependence of any sort bad. This is, again, a common thing. We talk about individuation in a lot of different psychological theories. And conformity is seen as a bad word. And I've used it that way in this lecture. But at the same time, not all conformity is a bad thing. Not all dependence is a bad thing. I'm very dependent upon a number of people in my family for many of my emotional needs. I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm happy with that. I'm thankful for that. But we tend to pathologize that in a lot of different ways, implicitly and explicitly. And I think we need to move beyond that. The other thing that I think is a real challenge here is when you take this approach to psychology and healing that's so rooted in independence and has a lot of assumptions that individualism is basically a good thing. How does this work with people that come from more collectivist background, from collectivist cultures? I think that, again, becomes a significant problem that we need to take into consideration. Science good, religion or spirituality is bad. This has changed a lot. It's, in some ways, I'd say it's not even fair to include this one in here because things have changed so much. But we do still see this bias pretty clear in the history of psychology, and so I think it was important to include yet because the historical lineage of some of this is still common and it's still expressed with a lot of people. Calm disagreement okay, anger bad. I've already used an example about that, so I'm not going to go into that. What does health look like in different cultural groups? This is another, I think, key question. In some cultures, harmony is a key part of what's understood as being healthy. That healthy is being in harmony with different, with your culture, with your group, with your family. This is something you see very strong in China. It's something you see very strong in Native American culture, but in a different way. Harmony is understood a little bit broader in certain ways in Native American culture, although I think a lot of Chinese culture will also take a broader understanding of what harmony is beyond just the social relationships, which are emphasized in particular. Emotional expressiveness is something that's seen as a part of being healthy in some cultures. But yet, as we talked about just a minute ago, this is pathologized often too. An openness to dealing with conflict. That, in many cultures, this may be seen as something that's good and healthy. Whereas in others, the culture that I grew up in, no, that's seen as something that's bad, as something that's destructive if you have conflict. The ability to sustain in suffering, going back to the religious examples that we talked about, this ability to sustain becomes very important. And I think when you look in certain settings, to refer back to the video that was a documentary that I mentioned earlier on Darfur Diaries, for many of these individuals, suffering has become a way of life. They've been displaced from their homes, sometimes many times. Violence is all around them, and the ability to sustain during times of suffering is really quite critical to what they are wanting to achieve. Some of the things that we may look for in our privileged culture in the United States are going to be quite a bit different in what we're going to try to attain. So it's important that we, again, allow for the context to, as well as the culture, to have an important influence on the decisions here. And spiritual or relational health. Again, a lot of people are going to look for this more than emotional or psychological health. And so we can ask then, as we're moving towards the end here, can there be one way to seek healing and or assess healing effectiveness? Should we create new ends and ways to assess these ends with each client? Well, you've seen some of my answer here is yes. And I think we need to start to broaden this out. Should we refer outside of therapy for healing sometimes? Again, I would think, well, maybe we should. Maybe we should consider, are there times where the healing that the person is seeking would be better sought through other means? And should we sometimes seek social or cultural healing instead of focusing on the individual? And again, I would say this is something absolutely. It's not often done that when we start, you take the example of the shootings that I mentioned, that the tendency is to go in and work with these people as individuals, but there also is a big impact on the culture that needs to be considered too, and that there needs to be healing on that level. So my hope is that this has opened up some of the questions that we'll be looking at. I've suggested some possible answers, but a lot of those are pretty vague that need to be unpacked quite a bit yet. What I encourage you to do is to join in the discussion by asking your own questions, because what's really critical to this class is that we get the questions right. And as we start to get the questions right, then we can start to look and find answers and seek answers, broader answers, different answers than those that are traditionally offered. And then begin starting to look at your own answers, whether those are ones that come from your culture that you agree with, or they're your answers on your own, from your own life, from your own explorations. And in particular, we want to be able to learn from each other about what are the unique ways of approaching healing that each of us can bring, that we can learn from each other. So as I wrap up here, again, what I'm really hoping is that this course can be something where we learn together to understand healing in a much broader context, that we can identify a lot of the biases that we bring, consider whether those are biases that we want to keep or those are biases that we'd like to let go of and move on from, to see different possibilities. And that we can journey together, learn together, and hopefully become better healers and better at doing our own healing together. I look forward to the rest of the course with all of you.